Greetings, traveler. I am SnapJelly, and the greatswords in Skyrim. Are they realistic? Well, there are a lot of swords to choose from, so I decided to put them into two categories, the good and the not so good. You have arrived at the second episode, the not so good. Now, the reason that I call this category the not so good is because, well, honestly, compared to the others, a lot of these swords are not half bad. And it was really difficult to categorize some of them, and I actually needed for a lot of them a little bit of personal bias. So, just for this video, I will actually put these swords in order, from the best of the worst to the worst of the worst, and I will explain my reasoning along the way. So join me in my quest, and I'll explain stuff. Starting off with the ancient Nordic greatsword. Now this one was a tough decision. Now you can see that there's a lot of added mass here right at the top, which will move the balance point upwards and thus make the sword heavier to use. Now I thought that maybe they compromised by making the pommel solid and thus heavier, moving the balance point back again. The sword would overall be heavier, but it wouldn't be as top heavy. However, the pommel is tiny and hollow at that. There's a hole in it. So there's not much weight in the handle. It is all moving towards the top. Now it was really difficult for me to choose between this sword or the Elven greatsword. Now I eventually decided that the Elven greatsword was better because of its potential tip control. You see, on historical greatswords, they usually have these incredibly massive guards so that the angle always protects your hands, and they more often than not house these incredibly large side rings to help you in a bind with poles or other greatswords. Now the swords in Skyrim don't have that. They have incredibly small guards, so parrying with them is gonna be more difficult. Parrying with a greatsword is simply harder. So if you don't have that extra protection on the guard, then you need tip control. And this sword provides neither of those. It doesn't have much tip control because the point of balance is going to be very high up the blade. And it doesn't have a particularly impressive guard. Not at all, actually. There's just not much there. It's better than some of the designs, but in all honesty, it's not going to do that much. So I eventually decided that the Elven greatsword beats this one because you would have more tip control on that one. And that's it. Technically the added mass here would increase cutting power, but on the other hand it also slows the swing down and it also decreases piercing capabilities because it's simply wider. So yeah, overall it was a tough decision, but I figured blocking with this thing is gonna be just a little bit too hard. Next up is the Stalhrim greatsword. Now on first glance, I thought this looked really good. I mean, it doesn't really have a good finish. Like it's pretty rough. So it's theoretically not going to be as good of a cutter as the rest of the swords, but you know, you can manage with that. The grip also looked very comfortable, just ordinary, nothing protruding from it, nothing weird, no spikes, no rims or nothing. So that was good, but that guard is weird. You see, it has a teeny tiny little upswept guard. Just a teeny tiny one. Just a teeny tiny one. Now, arguably, that wouldn't be preferable, but it doesn't make the sword unusable. It's just, you know, kinda more difficult. But it also has these little points. Yeah, and the guard is tiny, right? It's not like on a claymore. No, it's a pathetically small guard. Now, looking at the size of those spikes, any sword that slides down the edge of your blade will be catapulted off of that rim and most likely, you know, go over the guard. Because the guard is so small. Like honestly, it's too small. Without those points, it was already going to be difficult to use the sword effectively. But technically you can do it. However, with these things, the guard is completely useless. No sword is ever going to get stuck in that guard. So you essentially, once more, have very limited blocking capabilities. You could technically smack your enemy swords out of the way, but there's only a limit to how often that would work. Unless the sword would be incredibly light, of course. Next one is the Ebony greatsword. Now the grip is it's really long, but that's honestly not necessarily a bad thing. It can be similar to like a nagamaki, I imagine. And the blade is reasonable as well. Nothing especially exciting about it. But the grip is once more horrible. There is no clear way of telling where you're supposed to put your hands. There are just ridges and then some smooth surfaces and then more ridges everywhere. Where are your hands supposed to go? I mean, your hands don't completely stay in the same spot throughout the entire fight, right? Those ridges are gonna bother you one way or another. And there is another potential problem that I thought of. Now, something that you have to keep in mind when you think about swords is vibration, yes. You see, as two swords collide, they will vibrate. I hope you can see that. You see, it shakes. Now, on a sword, there are 2 points that do not vibrate. One is right over here. Do you see that? That's a point that stays still. And the other one should be in the handle, and this is to prevent the sword from violently shaking out of your hand as you're using it. Now, the thing is, if I hit it like this, you can see that the pommel does vibrate. The point that doesn't vibrate is it's incredibly small in your hand. There's always some vibration going on. And depending on how the sword is balanced, a longer grip might result in more vibration in the pommel. Now, is this a problem? Well, usually no. I mean, the vibration that happens, it happens, but not really. It's not really significant. But because the grip on the Ebony greatsword is already so uncomfortable, it might be a problem. Because it's very difficult to get a good grip on that sword, and now it's vibrating in your hand, which would make it even more difficult to get a good grip on the sword. Now, once more, it depends on how the sword is balanced. And I don't really know how the sword is balanced. I would need to have all kinds of good reproductions of the blade with all kinds of different balances in order to test if it would really work or not. But I can't do that. So it's very hard to judge, but it may result in, not being able to hold on to the sword. Or at least not comfortably. In any case, that grip is weird. It's just uncomfortable. Next one is the Bloodskal Blade. Now, right off the bat, you can see it has all kinds of individual points all over the blade. And yeah, that is just bad. That is just bad. Enemy blades are just gonna hit those all the time. And well, actually, these on top here might actually be the least troublesome. But this one and this one, yeah, definitely, that's just gonna be annoying. It wouldn't really make the blade useless, but it's really just a why kind of thing. There's no reason. It doesn't do anything for you. It just limits you. And I could complain about the small guard, as I have done, but there's something else that is honestly kind of weird. And that's the ricasso. As you can see here, there's some leather around this part. So this leads me to believe that you're supposed to grab this with your hand, right? As you do on a ricasso of a greatsword. But just look at how wide that blade is. You will never, ever be able to wrap your hand around that completely. Now, arguably you don't need to. You can still half sword without completely enclosing the blade with your hand, of course. But it's just kind of weird to have a segment that you're supposed to grab with your hand and have it be too wide for it to be able to grab with your hand. I mean, the grip honestly already looks kind of wide, so just imagine how wide the blade actually is. That's just odd. Also, there are some stud-like things on the blade. Yeah, they look really small. I mean, I don't know if they're really gonna be a problem, but in all honesty, they're not gonna do you any good. I gotta say, I do like the length of the grip, though. I mean, honestly, just imagining how much power you would be able to exert with this sword, I would like it. If it didn't have, these spikes and those studs, and, well, the ricasso, it doesn't really do anything. But, I like the idea of swinging this sword around. I feel like it would be very powerful. Next one is the glass greatsword. Remember those things I said in the beginning about being top-heavy? Yeah. Remember those things I've been saying the entire time about, segments and points halfway through the blade? Yeah. Well, about these two spikes, I don't really think they would get in the way, but they're not gonna do anything for you either. And considering it has so much mass at the top, you would say that that is supposed to be the part that you would cut with. That would be the most powerful part. But there are grooves in it. There are literal grooves. That is gonna quite significantly weaken the cut. And also, it would theoretically weaken the material as well. Now then, once more, there's the fact that it's made out of malachite and how strong that would actually be, but, just thought I would mention it. Grooves in the blade are, yeah, that's not really a smart thing to do. Especially this deep. Now there's also just the two teeny tiny little nitpicks I have about the grip of this sword. One is the segment that there is right at the pommel, right here. I mean, like I said, your hand is not going to stay still constantly. And to have a segment like that, roughly where your left hand is supposed to be, that is just going to be rubbing against your hand the entire time. And that's going to be very uncomfortable. So, that's not good. And the other one is another segment right here, like right underneath the guard. It's usually not a good thing to have some sort of ridge right underneath the guard, because that is where your primary hand is supposed to be. At least if you want to get the most tip control. And you once more have the same problem, it's just constantly gonna be rubbing against your hand. And that's gonna be annoying. And just looking at it like this sword, it seems like it would be an awful lot more tip heavy than the ancient Nord one would be. Yeah, swinging this around is gonna be incredibly tough. So I don't think you would be able to use this effectively. Maybe for bottle cuts, but not in a fight. Next one is the Nordic Great Sword. Oh boy. Alright, so this ridge makes this Quillon practically useless. I mean, once more, swords will, slide down, and then they will hit the ridge, and that is where they will stop. I mean, this Quillon is there to supposedly protect your hand, if you're half-swording, if your hand is over here, but, I mean, it won't ever hit the Quillon. The chances of an enemy blade hitting this Quillon, but not this ridge, is incredibly small. Is that a bad thing? Nah, not per se, not really. But it is weird, though. It's just a weird design choice. On the other side, literally, on the other side, there is some added thickness, which will once more propel enemy swords over your guard. Why? These two ridges right here make these extra Quillons practically useless. There are some hooks at the top too, which won't really do anything for you except potentially get stuck on your enemy's clothing. And there is some significant difference in thickness of the grip as well. It's way thicker at the pommel than it is at the guard, which is gonna be quite uncomfortable to grip, but, you could technically deal with that if you get used to it. However, the guard has these little downwards spikes, just teeny tiny little points there. Oh boy, that is weird. Why? I mean, you could argue that you can fight with your hands a little bit further down. But, as I have said twice now, your hands don't always stay in the same spot during a fight. With these little points right here, you are gonna have to constantly mind not hitting your own arm with your guard. If you don't pay attention to it for 2 seconds, you are gonna poke yourself in the arm. And there is something very weird about this ricasso as well. Well, it's not the ricasso, it's the guard. It has upward spikes. Now usually, I personally really like upwards pointy things on guards. But not if you're supposed to put your hand there. Like, how does that even seem remotely safe? You're supposed to put your hand here, and have your arm just somewhere around this giant spike. How does that even make sense? So, this sword kinda makes it impossible to do any of the things that you're supposed to do. Like, you can't half sword because you'll stab yourself in the arm. You can't use it normally because you'll potentially scrape yourself on the arm. And even if you do manage to get a cut in, then there's gonna be all kinds of hooks and stuff which are gonna probably be annoying one way or another. So yeah, I mean, technically you could swing this around, and you could also do some damage with it, quite a lot. But, you know, in an actual fight, wouldn't really work. And the last one is the Daedric greatsword. Well, alright, now first off, the guard kinda forces you to hold it this way, right? You can't hold it that way because then the guard will be in the way. You have no place to put your hands, so you have to hold it this way. Okay, great. Not necessarily a problem. There is, however, on the other side of the guard, the thing that it's kinda, you know, edged downwards. Just a little bit. Like, it's just like a weird downwards curve, which is gonna force your hand further down for no reason. Like, honestly, why is it shaped like that? It makes no sense. The pommel has two spikes, one in the front and one in the back. So that is great for potentially pommeling your enemy in the face, and you also have to constantly mind not accidentally scraping yourself with your pommel. Once more, if you let your guard down for 2 seconds, you might rake yourself with one of those. Alright, now let's take a look at the blade. Serration, serration, serration. Serration everywhere. They don't seem sharpened either, like they're just segments. Just individual segments all over the blade. The false edge seems to be completely sharpened, which is not a bad thing, but you know, since your hand is forced to in a certain position, it is kind of a weird thing. You see, this may as well have been a single-edged blade, since you're supposed to hold the sword this way anyway. Now, false cuts can happen with a single-edged blade, but it's usually with the tippy top of the blade, with, you know, the point. But there is none right here. Like, honestly, the false edge on the top is gone. It's not there. So the part that you can most effectively do false cuts with on this sword is not there. In all honesty, there's not much more that I can really say about this. It's just that it's not good at anything. I mean, you could stab with it. It's fairly pointy, so you could stab with it. But yeah, this blade, it kind of limits you in everything you want to do, one way or another. So to use in an actual battle, this one is by far the worst. So that was it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. You can click the button right here to watch part 1, or you can click this button if you want to see if the single-handed swords in Skyrim are realistic. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye, guys.